Welcome to Bethesda, 20814. In this Washington, D.C. suburb, 29% of homes cost over $1 million, and 54% of residents own their own homes. Both its high schools are ranked in the top 15 in the state of Maryland, according to U.S. News, and its downtown area is famous for its popular amenities. But there's nothing special about Bethesda. There are many similar suburbs across the United States, including Potomac, Chevy Chase, and Arlington, all in the D.C. area itself. But if we cross Georgia Avenue, which is just one neighborhood over from Bethesda in Montgomery County, we arrive at Silver Spring, 20910. Well, this isn't exactly the other side of the tracks. Less than 2% of the homes here cost over $1 million, and just 31% of Silver Spring residents own their own homes. Its 6 high schools have an average rank of 62 in the state of Maryland, and its residents are twice as likely to become a victim of crime than anywhere else in the state of Maryland. But everyone knows that there are good and bad neighborhoods all across the United States, so why does this matter? Well, less than 14% of Bethesda residents are Black or Hispanic, which is less than half the national average of 30%. In contrast, more than 44% of Silver Spring residents are Black or Hispanic, which is 50% higher than the national average.
Even in a place like Montgomery County that are almost exclusively highly affluent, predominantly white, and you've got neighborhoods that are much less affluent, predominantly Hispanic, African American.
Given that the same disparity exists between neighboring communities all across the United States, how did this happen? Well, the short answer is this.
The federal government in the early to middle part of the 20th century established programs that were designed to help expand access to affordable housing, but only for specific groups of people and only in particular neighborhoods. And they did that in ways that in some cases were explicitly designed to exclude African Americans or others who were considered undesirable.
One of the prime goals has been home ownership in this country, and that's, if you ask that, at the start of last century, I think there's an important caveat there for home ownership for who. We know that historically home ownership has not been available to everyone, going back to specific covenants on race and public policy associated with the Homeowners Loan Corporation, known as redlining, which I imagine at this point you've probably heard a bit about. It made it very difficult for communities of color to receive mortgage lending.
To better understand how the federal government inevitably helped segregate America, let's take a look at 4 key events in the history of federal housing policy, which got its start in the New Deal. In 1934, the Federal Housing Administration was created to ensure home mortgages, introducing the now commonplace low down payment, 30-year mortgage plans that has made housing affordable to millions of Americans. However, the FHA redlined neighborhoods with non-white residents as hazardous, limiting its investment in such neighborhoods. 4 years later, the Federal National Mortgage Association was established. It made low-cost loans widely available by purchasing loans from banks and securitizing them. But over the next 30 years, only 2% of its loans went to non-whites. In 1956, Congress funded the National Highway System, but it cut through Black and other minority neighborhoods. So while Congress tried to reverse course with the Fair Housing Act of 1968 that prohibited discrimination in the financing of housing based on race, the loss of intergenerational wealth has had a permanent impact.
In fact, a statistic that we talk about a lot at the Urban Institute is that the homeownership rate for African Americans is actually less or just below what it was after the passage of the Fair Housing Act.
The late 20th century, it started to become clear that simply prohibiting formal discrimination was not going to be enough to reverse the patterns of socioeconomic as well as racial segregation that had been created by a long history of discriminatory practices.
So, while in theory, the Fair Housing Act prohibited discrimination in housing, it has seldom prevented discrimination in practice.
For example, there was a Black woman who was trying to buy a home, and when she got her house appraised, it was significantly lower than when she got her friend to pretend to be her and got the same house appraised, but it just so happened that this friend wasn't Black, and her house was valued at much more. And this just happened last year or earlier this year. And the only difference was that they had a different skin tone that made their houses more valuable, that made the house more valuable, but inevitably it was the same house.
In fact, a 2018 study by the Brookings Institute found that Black homes were devalued by an average of $48,000, which means that Black people have received less for their homes and have been more likely to be denied a mortgage when they try to buy a home. But given that it's hard to imagine how housing discrimination today could be anything like it was before the passage of the Fair Housing Act, why has the 30-point gap between Black and white home ownership rates and the resulting wealth gap persisted more than 50 years later? Well, a major contributing factor appears to be that the federal government has, for the most part, taken the stance that land use is a local issue, which in turn has allowed local governments to keep affordable housing out of wealthier white neighborhoods, using exclusionary zoning laws. But what exactly is exclusionary zoning?
Exclusionary zoning laws, if you're talking about lot size, density, park requirements, building codes.
Building codes, lot sizes, sounds harmless. So what's exclusionary about such regulations?
Exclusionary zoning laws are policies that keep affordable homes out of certain neighborhoods, particularly more affluent and more white neighborhoods. So exclusionary zoning laws prevent, for example, duplexes, triplexes, types of apartments from being built, and typically are only allow single-family homes to be available.
And those types of regulations are considered by some to be exclusionary because it does, when you increase the price and the requirements to build a structure, well, yeah, that does mean that it costs more to live there. And there are some individuals that aren't, we don't live in a society where everyone makes equal income. So it will price some people out of those communities. And there are, and these policies, while they do make housing less affordable, that doesn't mean that it's illegal or unlawful what they're doing. We each have the ability to choose where we want to live.
So you see, exclusionary zoning laws prevent families from buying into certain neighborhoods unless they can afford a single-family home. Given that no one expects that everyone should be able to afford a home in Beverly Hills or Tribeca, many feel that such regulations simply cater to the diverse preferences of our diverse population.
And some people prefer to have more affordable, but live in an area where people have a lot more freedom as far as what to put on their properties, whether it's apartments, whether it's a huge yard, small yard, whether it's a big house, a small house. But some people prefer to live in communities that are a lot more orderly, that might actually require you to have a 1 acre lot limit. And I, as an individual, I might choose to live in an area where all those regulations aren't in place. And that's the great thing about this country. I can choose to live there. If I want to find a more affordable home and I want to be able to develop it any way I want to develop it with no restrictions in place, there are many, many communities in this country where that can be done. But if I want to live in a community and choose to be in a community that requires to have a minimum lot size, that doesn't allow high density apartment buildings, that doesn't want, say, a government subsidized affordable housing complex built in the middle of town.
But others believe that exclusionary zoning serves a more nefarious purpose.
There's no part of the law that's labeled exclusionary zoning. That's a term that's applied to describe laws that have the effect of keeping certain people out. At a minimum, keeping people out who don't have as much money, and in some cases, keeping people out who are African American, Hispanic, Asian.
If there is a zoning law, for example, a single-family zoning law, where a family cannot move into a home unless they can afford a single-family home,
They are concentrated into what people may call quote unquote ghetto or the hood, which then limits them and traps them. Exclusionary zoning perpetuates a cycle of concentrated poverty and race and class discrimination. Zoning is the new redlining. So we saw redlining as a historical form of discriminating against particularly Black Americans. Exclusionary zoning is that new form, and it has not been legally forbidden among localities.
Allowing duplexes and triplexes to be built in neighborhoods currently zoned for single-family homes would certainly raise the population density of these neighborhoods, putting pressure on the local schools, transportation networks, and other public services. But it is hard to argue that the duplexes and triplexes would ruin the character of these neighborhoods. If anything, they would enrich these neighborhoods by allowing for greater diversity. The two Americas that Martin Luther King Jr. once talked about. One overflowing with the milk of prosperity and the honey of opportunity, and another with a daily ugliness about it that constantly transforms the ebullience of hope into the fatigue of despair, persists today, in part due to exclusionary zoning. So perhaps it is time to dismantle the institutions that keep us apart, so we can live together as one people, one America.